Della Rourke, 53, a widow 2 winters gone, crosses a frozen Nebraska field in the black before sunrise and splits another man's firewood by lantern light, and never once let him know it was her breath. The ring of the axe. The cold, 91 mornings. All winter long, she stacked the wood of Amos Cade, a grieving man who'd let his own grow cold. The town clucked that Rourke woman, warming a grave cold house that'll never warm her back. She stacked it anyway. Then one morning Amos woke early and stood at the window, watching who bent over his woodpile. What he said when he finally spoke to her, no one in Sable Creek was ready for. If you believe it's never too late for the heart, this story is for you. Subscribe and comment the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far Della's woodpile travels. The cold in Sable Creek had a sound to it. Della Rourke knew that sound. It was the creak of the well rope gone stiff. It was the pop of green wood in the stove. It was the way the wind came off the flat fields and found every gap in a house and sang there, low, all night. It was the winter of 1934, and the whole county was quiet the way a man is quiet when he owes money. Della was 53 years old. She had buried her husband Henry 2 winters back, and she had kept his farm alone ever since. It was a small place, a quarter section, most of it worn thin, the topsoil half of it gone to the sky in the dry years. But it was hers. She fed her few chickens. She milked her 1 cow. She split her own wood. That was the thing folks noticed about Della, if they noticed her at all. The woman split her own wood. By the door of her kitchen hung an axe. Henry's axe. The handle of it had gone smooth and dark, first from his grip and now from hers. He had taught her to use it. Stand square, he'd said. Let the weight of the head do the work. Aim for the block, not the wood. She had laughed at him then. She was a town girl once, and the idea of a woman splitting wood struck her as something to laugh at. She did not laugh at it now. It was the only thing that kept her warm. Henry had been a good man. Not a large man, not a loud one. He had a way of standing close to the stove with his hands out, saying nothing, and that was enough. When he died, the house got very big. Della had not known a house could get bigger after a person left it. But it did. She woke early most mornings, before the light. It was easier than lying there. In the dark, she would build the fire and set the coffee and stand at the window looking out at the black field, and she would ache. That was the honest word for it. Ache. Not for Henry only. For being of use. For mattering to somebody. For a house that had a reason to be warm. She was not a woman who said such things out loud. She was neighborly. That was the word she used for herself. Neighborly. Across the section line, a half-mile east, lived Amos Cade. Amos was 64. Once he had been the best farmer for 40 miles, and everyone would tell you so. His corn came up straight when other men's went crooked. His stock was fat. His fences held. When a young man wanted to know how a thing was done, he went and asked Amos Cade, and Amos would show him, patient, with his big, slow hands. Then a year ago, Amos buried his wife Ruth, and he stopped. He did not stop all at once. Grief does not work all at once. It works like the cold. It finds the gaps. First the fences went. Then the stock got thin, because a man has to want to feed a thing, and Amos did not want much of anything. His house went cold. The great woodpile that Ruth used to fuss at him about. The one that had stood tall as a man against the north wall for 30 years. That woodpile went down, and Amos did not build it back. He let his own fire grow cold, and he sat in the cold, because it seemed right to him. It seemed like the only honest thing. Ruth was in the ground, and the ground was cold, and who was he to sit warm? Everyone in Sable Creek knew Amos was behind at the bank. Nobody said the word out loud. You did not say that word about a man in those years. Half the county was behind at the bank. You just kept your eyes down and your mouth shut, and you prayed the note that got called would not be your note. So there they were, a widow and a widower, a half-mile apart, each one alone in a cold house, and neither one knowing the first thing about the other's grief. That is how it can be with people. You can freeze within shouting distance of somebody who would warm you and never know it. It was the Christmas service that started it. The church at Sable Creek was small, and it had one stove, an old iron thing near the front, and on a cold Sunday the folks who came early got the pews near the stove, and the folks who came late sat in the back and shivered. That was the ordinary arrangement. Nobody thought about it. Della came that morning and took her place, and partway through the singing she looked across the aisle. And she saw Amos Cade. He was sitting near the back. Alone, his coat was thin. It was a good coat once, you could see that, but it had gone thin at the elbows, and he had it buttoned to the throat, and his lips were blue. Blue as a plum. He was shivering and trying not to, holding himself very still the way a proud man does when his body is betraying him in public. There was room by the stove. There was room right up front where the warmth was. And Amos Cade would not take it. Della understood him in that moment better than she had understood anybody in 2 years. She saw it plain. He would not go and sit warm. He would not be seen needing a thing. He would sit in the back in the cold with his blue lips and his thin coat before he would let one soul in that church see Amos Cade come to the stove like a beggar. And she thought, that is a man freezing on purpose. That is a man who has decided he does not deserve to be warm. She did not say anything to him. What was there to say? You did not walk up to Amos Cade and tell him to come sit by the fire. He'd have gone home first. But she went home that morning, and she could not get the picture out of her head. The blue lips, the thin coat, the stubborn straight back of him. She thought about that great empty woodpile she could see from her own east fence. Everybody could see it. A woodpile against a north wall told you everything about a farm. A full one said a man was ready for winter, was taking care, was going to make it. Amos Cade's woodpile said he had quit. That night Della did not sleep much. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind sing in the gaps, and somewhere before the middle of the night she made up her mind about a thing. She got up while it was still black. It was the coldest part of the night, the part before dawn when even the stars look frozen. She built no fire for herself. She dressed in Henry's old coat and Henry's old gloves, and she took Henry's axe down from its place by the door, and she went out. The field between her place and the Cades was frozen hard. Her boots rang on it. Her breath went out in front of her like smoke and hung there. She carried a lantern, hooded low, and by its little light she crossed the section line, half a mile alone, into another person's yard. The Cade house was dark. Not one window lit. She could hear no sound from it. She went to the woodpile, what was left of it, and she found the chopping block. And beside it a poor heap of unsplit rounds that Amos had cut in the fall and never gotten to. Della set the lantern down. She spat on her hands the way Henry taught her. She stood square. She set a round up on the block, and she swung. The axe came down clean, and the wood fell open in 2 white halves, and the sound of it went out across the frozen field, a hard ringing crack. Loud in all that silence. She stopped. She looked at the dark house. No light came on. No door opened. So she set up another round, and she swung again. She worked till the sky in the east went from black to gray. She split, and she stacked, laying the split wood up neat against the north wall the way a wall of wood ought to be laid, tight and square. Her arms burned, her breath tore. Her face was numb, but the rest of her had gone hot with the work. The good clean hot of a body doing something it was made to do. When the gray came, she stopped. She had a good stack laid up, most of a cord. She took her lantern and her axe, and she went home across the field before the sun came, and she told not one living soul. She only meant to do it the once. That is the truth of it. She told herself it was a Christian thing, a neighborly thing, and once was enough. But the next night she lay awake again, and she thought of that blue-lipped man, and before dawn she got up and went again. And then it was 91 mornings. All that winter. In the black before the sun, Della Rourke crossed the frozen section line with her dead husband's axe. And she split Amos Cade's wood, and she stacked it, and she went home, and she never let him know it was her. The stack against the north wall grew tall, tall as a man, tall as it had been in Ruth's day. And a strange thing began to happen to Amos, though he did not understand it and she did not see it. His house got warm. He would come down in the morning, in the cold, and go out to the woodpile expecting the sad low heap he had left, and there would be wood. Split wood. Good dry split wood, stacked tight, more of it every day. He did not know what to make of it. The first time he thought he had misremembered. The second time he stood there a long while with his hand on the stacked wood. And something moved in him that he had not felt in a year. He built his fire that morning, he built it big. And he sat by it and he was warm, and being warm made him weep, though he could not have told you why, and he was glad no one was there to see it. Because a man who is warm starts to want to live again. That is a dangerous thing. Amos had not wanted to live in a year. Now here was some fool leaving him wood, and the fire was hot, and his blood came back into his hands, and he found, to his own shame, that he was hungry. He had not been hungry in a long time. And there were other things, small things. His gate latch had been broke since the fall, hanging by a nail, banging in the wind. One morning it was mended. Somebody had set a new pin in it, and it swung true and latched clean. He never saw who. Then, another morning, there was broth. A crock of it, covered with a clean cloth, set on his step in the cold, still warm. Beef broth with barley in it. He stood in his doorway and looked at it a long time. Then he took it in and he ate it, standing up, from the crock. And it was the best thing he had tasted since Ruth died. He set the clean crock back on the step the next night, and in the morning it was gone. Amos Cade began to wonder. He was not a stupid man. Somebody was doing this. Somebody was warming his house, mending his farm, feeding him, in the dark and asking nothing, and letting him keep his pride by never once knocking on his door. He did not know who. But he began to want the morning to come, so he could go out and see what the dark had left him. And a man who wants the morning to come is a man being pulled back to life whether he means to be or not. He thought maybe it was the church, some committee, some arrangement of the deacons. He almost asked, once, after service. But he was too proud to ask, because asking meant admitting he'd been getting charity, and Amos Cade would sooner have died in a snowbank than admit that. It was around then that they had their one real word with each other, the whole first half of that winter. And it is a thing worth telling, because of what he said. It was at Voss's store in town. Harlan Voss kept the general store at Sable Creek, and everybody came through it sooner or later. Amos had come in for a sack of meal, counting his coins careful on the counter. Della was there buying thread. They ended up by the door at the same time, and it would have been rude not to speak. Cold enough, Amos said. Cold enough, she agreed. She looked at him. His color was better than it had been at Christmas. There was more of him in his eyes. And a foolish warm thing rose up in her, because she knew why, and he did not, and it was hers to know. "You're looking well, Amos," she said. She could not help it. He gave a short laugh, not unkind, but bitter, the laugh of a man making sport of himself before anyone else can. "Am I? Well, some angel's been leaving wood at my pile. I don't deserve it, but I'll not turn it down." Then he looked at her, really looked, and something crossed his face. Some old flicker of the man he used to be, the man who noticed a good woman when one stood in front of him. "You're a fine neighbor, Della Rourke," he said. "You've always been a fine, good woman." And then, half to make a joke of it, half to shove away a thing that scared him, he said the words, "Were I younger, you'd be my wife. But an old man's got no business talking so." And he touched his hat, and he took his meal, and he went out into the cold, laughing at himself, and never saw her face. Della stood by the door of Voss's store with her thread in her hand, and she could not have moved for anything. He had said it lightly. He meant it as nothing, as a way to close a door. But it went into her like the cold goes into a house, right through the gaps. Because she had told herself, for 2 years, that her chance at such a thing was buried with Henry. That a woman of 53 did not get chosen. That she was too old for anybody's wife, and it was foolish to want it, and she did not want it, she only wanted to be neighborly. And a broken-down man with blue lips had said it to her plain, as a joke, and meant nothing, and it near knocked her down. She did not answer him. He was gone before she could. She bought her thread, and she went home. And that night she got up in the black before dawn, and she crossed the field again, and she split his wood, and she did not stop. That is the part folks never understood, later, why she kept on. It was not charity by then. Maybe it never had been. It was that once a man says a thing like that to you, even as a joke, some door you thought was nailed shut swings open an inch, and the light comes through, and you cannot nail it back. You would give anything for that inch of light. You would split wood in the dark all winter for it. But you cannot keep a secret forever in a place like Sable Creek. The county was small and folks watched. It was a man named Tolliver who first saw the lantern. He was driving his team to town in the black, early, and he passed the Cade place, and he saw a light moving at the woodpile, low, hooded, and the shape of somebody swinging an axe. A woman's shape. He could not make out the face. But he saw a woman's skirt below the man's coat, and he saw the swing of long hair come loose from under the hat, and he wondered. And he told his wife. And his wife told 2 others, and by Sunday the whole congregation of the Sable Creek Church knew that some woman was going before dawn to Amos Cade's farm and splitting his wood. You can imagine how that ran through a small church. Some thought it scandalous. A woman, alone, at a widower's place. In the dark. Others thought it was the tenderest thing they'd ever heard, and could not for their lives guess who. They looked around the pews at all the widows and the spinsters and the lonely wives, and they whispered, and they guessed wrong. Della came in that Sunday like any other Sunday, and she did not know she'd been seen. But there were wood chips on her sleeve, pale curls of split pine caught in the wool of her coat that she had not brushed away. And a woman 2 rows back saw them, and leaned to another, and pointed with her chin. And the whisper went down the pews like wind through wheat, and turned, one head at a time, toward Della Rourke. She felt it before she understood it. That prickle on the back of the neck. She turned and saw a dozen faces looking at her and looking away, and she looked down at her own sleeve, and saw the wood chips there, pale against the dark wool, plain as a signed confession. Her face went hot, but she lifted her chin. She was not going to brush them off now. That would be admitting to something, and she would not perform her shame for a church full of whisperers. But the worst of it was Amos. He was there that morning, up front now, near the stove, warm for once. And he heard the whispering same as anybody. And a man near him leaned over and told him, thinking to do him a kindness, told him a woman had been seen splitting his wood in the dark all winter, and that was where his fine full woodpile had come from. Amos Cade went pale, then red. He stood up, right there in the church, in the middle of the service he stood up, and his voice shook. "I'll take no man's pity," he said, loud, so the whole church heard him. "I've worked my own land 40 years, and I'll not be made a charity case in front of the county. Whoever's been at my woodpile can leave off. I never asked it, and I'll not have it." He did not know it was no man at all. He looked out over that church full of faces, and he did not once look at Della Rourke, because it never entered his mind. She was too fine a woman. She was too far above it. It never crossed him that the angel at his woodpile was the good widow 2 rows over with the pine curls on her sleeve. Della sat very still through all of it and said not one word. She let him say his piece. She let the whole church think what it thought. She walked out after service with her chin up and the wood chips still on her sleeve, past all of them, and she did not explain herself to a living soul. And the next morning, in the black before dawn, she got up and she crossed the frozen field, and she split his wood again. Because he had told her to stop, in front of the whole county, and she found she would not. Some quiet, stubborn thing had set its heels in her. He could shout in church all he liked. He could take no man's pity. But it was no man giving it, and she was not offering pity, and she would decide when she was through. Not him, and not the church, and not the whispering town. That was the shift in her. Up till then she had done it soft, secret, half ashamed, calling it neighborly. Now there was iron under it. Let them talk. Let him rage. She had made up her mind that Amos Cade was not going to freeze while she had 2 arms and Henry's axe, and that was the end of it. It was only a matter of time before he woke early enough to catch her. It came on a morning in February, the coldest yet. Amos could not sleep. His grief had a bad night sometimes still, and this was one. And he lay awake in the black, and then he heard it. Out in the yard. The crack of an axe. He got up. He went to the window in his stocking feet, and he wiped the frost from the glass, and he looked out. There, by the woodpile, in the last of the dark, was a lantern. And bent over the chopping block, swinging steady, was a woman in a man's coat. He could not see her face. But he watched her set a round up on the block and swing, clean and square, the way a person swings who knows how, who was taught right, and the wood fell open and she reached for another. His heart did a thing he did not want it to do. He put on his boots and his coat and he went out. The cold hit him like a wall. His breath tore. He crossed the yard, and she heard his step, and she straightened up and turned, the lantern between them, and there in its yellow light was the face of Della Rourke. Neither one said anything for a moment. Her breath and his breath went up together and mixed in the cold. Della, he said, just her name, and then his eye fell on the axe in her hands. And he knew it. He would have known it anywhere. That smooth, dark handle, worn to a shine, the particular curve of it. He had seen Henry Rourke swing that axe 100 times, at barn raisings and hog killings, 20 years of them. It was Henry's axe. It was a dead man's axe, in a good woman's hands, splitting Amos Cade's wood in the dark before dawn, and had been all winter. And Amos understood the whole of it in one breath, and it was too much for him. It was too much kindness to have taken without knowing. It was too much to owe. His pride, the last thing he had, rose up and choked him. "Put it down," he said. His voice was rough. "Put it down and go home. I told the whole church I'd have no pity, and I meant it. You'll not come here again, do you hear? You'll not." Della set the round down. She did not put the axe down. She stood square, the way Henry taught her, and she looked at the broken, proud old man in front of her, and she was not angry. She saw right through the rage to the fear under it. She had lived alone 2 years. She knew fear when she saw it wearing anger's coat. "I hear you fine, Amos Cade," she said. "Quiet. I've heard you. Now you hear me. I'll come as long as it's cold and there's wood to split. You can't stop a person being neighborly. You can only be rude about it." And she picked up her lantern, and she left the wood she'd split stacked neat against his wall, and she walked home across the field in the graying dark, with his eyes on her back the whole way. She came again the next morning. And the next. He did not come out again. But sometimes she saw the frost wiped clear on the window glass, a little round patch of it, and she knew he stood behind it watching, and she let him watch. It was on a gray morning near the end of that month that the other thing came. The thing that changed it all from a quiet matter between 2 people into a matter for the whole county. A motor car came out from town. That was rare enough to bring folks to their windows all down the road. It was a bank car. It stopped at the Cade gate, and a man got out. His name was Vernon Pike, and he was the loan officer for the Cattlemen's Trust Bank, and he wore a good wool overcoat and carried a hammer and a paper. He did not knock at the house. He did not speak to Amos Cade at all. He walked up to the Cade gate, the mended gate with the good pin in the latch, and he took a nail, and he nailed his paper to the gatepost, hard. 4 strokes of the hammer that rang out flat in the cold. Then he got back in his car and drove away. Amos came out and read it. Della, on her own place, saw the car and saw it stop and saw the man nail the paper, and she came across the field though it was full daylight, and she had no business there in daylight, and she stood beside Amos Cade at his own gate and read it too. It was a notice of foreclosure. The Cattlemen's Trust had called the note. $214 was owed, and it was due in full by the 15th day of March, and if it was not paid by then, the Cade farm, the house, the land, the barn, all of it, 40 years of a man's life, would be sold at public auction on the courthouse steps to the highest bidder. $214. In that winter, in that county, it may as well have been $214,000. There was not that much cash money in the whole township. Amos stood at his gate and looked at the paper, and all the life that had come back into his face over that warm winter drained out of it again, gray as the sky. "Well," he said. Just that. "Well." He turned and walked back into his house and shut the door. Della stood alone at the gate in the daylight, with the notice in front of her, the 4 nail heads bright and new in the old gray wood. She read it again. The 15th of March. $214. The courthouse steps. And something happened in her then. It was not grief. It was not the ache she'd carried 2 years. It was hotter and cleaner than that. It was the same thing that had set its heels in her in the church, only bigger now, and burning. She thought of Amos Cade keeping this county fed for 30 years. She thought of every young man he'd ever taught to plow a straight furrow. She thought of him blue-lipped in the back of a cold church, too proud to sit by the stove. And warm again at last, because she'd carried wood to him in the dark, and now a man in a wool overcoat had driven out from town and nailed the end of him to his own gatepost and driven away without so much as a word. She reached up and she laid her hand flat on that paper. Then she turned from the gate, and she did not go home. She went the other way. She went toward town, toward Voss's store, where on any given afternoon half the county could be found standing about the stove, and she walked fast, and her jaw was set, and for the first time in 2 years Della Rourke had somewhere to be and a reason to matter, and God help the man who tried to stand in her way. Voss's store was warm and full of men. They stood about the stove with their hands in their pockets and their talk low. The way men talk when they have no work and no money and nothing to do but wait out a winter. Della came through the door and the cold came in with her. The bell rang. Every head turned. She did not take off her coat. She walked to the counter and she set her hand flat on it. The way she'd set her hand flat on that notice. "Harlan," she said. "You've heard about the Cade farm." Voss set down the tin he was holding. He was a heavy, decent man, and he'd known her a long time. "I heard," he said. "Pike drove out this morning. $214 by the 15th or it sells." "On the courthouse steps," Della said. "On the steps." The men had gone quiet. She could feel them behind her, listening. She turned around and looked at them. She knew every face in that room. She'd sat in church with them. She'd buried her husband while they carried the box. "Amos Cade," she said, "kept this county fed for 30 years. Nobody spoke." When your father's plow broke in the spring of '09, whose team pulled the furrow? When the Hendricks boy took sick and there was no one to bring in the corn, who brought it in? For nothing. For a plate of supper and a thank you. She looked from man to man. That man is 64 years old, and there is a bank in the city that means to put him out in the cold to die. And I am standing here asking you what this county is going to do about it. A man by the stove cleared his throat. It was Tolliver, the same Tolliver who'd seen her lantern and told the town. "Della," he said, not unkind. "There's no money. There's not $200 cash in the whole township. You know that. I know it, she said. I'm not asking for $200. She let that sit. I'm asking for pennies, she said, and I'm asking you to come. They didn't understand her yet. But some of the older men did. She saw it move across their faces, one and then another, the memory of a thing they'd heard done 2 counties over. A thing that had a name. A sale's a sale, Della said. The bank can call it. The law says they've got to sell it on the steps to whoever bids highest. It doesn't say who comes to bid. And it doesn't say what a man's neighbors will do to a stranger who bids against them. She looked at Voss. It's lawful, Harlan. Every bit of it's lawful. A man bids a penny, the next man bids nothing over him. And if some speculator from the city thinks he'll buy a good farm cheap off an old man's misery, well, he'll find the whole county standing between him and the auctioneer, and he'll think better of it. The store was very still. They'll sell it for pennies, she said to us, and we'll give it back. And then it was not still anymore. The men began to talk all at once. She did not stay for the talking. She'd planted the thing, it would grow now without her standing over it. She went back out into the cold and got up on her wagon and turned the team toward home, and for the first time in 2 years she did not feel the cold at all. She did not stop splitting his wood. Every morning still, before the sun, she crossed the section line with Henry's axe over her shoulder and the hooded lantern swinging low. Amos had told her to stop. She had not stopped. He knew now it was her, and she knew he knew, and neither of them spoke of it, and still every morning the ring of the axe came across the frozen field to his house before he was awake, and every morning he lay in his cold bed and listened to it. She did more than the wood now. She had stopped hiding. She mended the shingle that had come loose over his kitchen, climbing up on a ladder in the gray light with a hammer and 3 nails from her own barn. She swept his threshold. She saw his stock were thin, and she carried over hay in the wagon and forked it into his manger, and his old cow lowed at her like she was somebody. She left the broth on the step the way she always had, the crock covered against the cold. And in the morning the crock would be on the step again, empty and rinsed clean, set out for her to take back. That was the only word that passed between them for a long time. A clean crock, set out on a step. It was a kind of thank you. It was the only kind he had. Then one evening in the last of February she came at dusk instead of dawn, with a basket, and she did not knock. She lifted the latch she'd mended herself and she went in. He was sitting in the dark by a stove that had gone near out. He looked up at her. He did not tell her to go. She built the fire. She never said a word. She cooked at Rourke Cade's stove with Rourke Cade's pans, and she set 2 plates on the table, and she filled them, and she sat down across from him, and they ate. The first meal cooked in that house for 2 people in over a year. Neither of them spoke through the whole of it. There was nothing that needed saying that a plate of hot food did not say better. It was while she was putting the pans away that she saw it. The cedar chest against the wall stood open a hand's width, the way a thing stands that has been opened and not quite shut, a long time ago. She went to close it, gentle, so it wouldn't bang, and she saw, folded inside, a quilt. It was a wedding ring quilt. Interlocking rings of calico, blue and rose and faded gold, the kind a woman pieces for a marriage bed. It was not finished. One whole corner of it was only basted, the needle still run through the cloth where a hand had stopped, a year ago, and never gone on. Rourke Cade's hand. Rourke Cade's quilt, that she'd been making when she died, and that no one had touched since. Della stood over it a moment. She understood then the size of the thing she'd walked into. She was warming a house that was still full of another woman. She reached down, and she did not take the quilt out, and she did not smooth it, for it was not hers to smooth. She only closed the lid, soft, and set her hand on the cedar a moment the way you'd set your hand on a shoulder. Then she took her basket and she went home across the dark field, and she thought about the needle standing in the cloth all the way. Harlan Voss came to call on her the first week of March. He came proper, in his Sunday coat, in the afternoon with the wagon washed. He sat in her front room, with his hat on his knee, and he was a long time coming to it, and when he came to it, he came honest. "Della," he said, "I'm a comfortable man. The store does well even in a year like this. I've no debts and no notes called, and I'm not a young fool anymore. I'd not gossip you, and I'd not want you working a failing quarter section alone another winter." He turned the hat in his hands. "I'm asking you to marry me. I'd be good to you. There'd be nothing for the town to talk about. You'd be safe and warm and done with worrying." And it was, God knew, everything a sensible widow of 53 ought to have said yes to before he'd finished the sentence. Safe, warm, no gossip. A good man who owed nobody. She looked at her hands. "You honor me, Harlan," she said. "You do. And I'm not going to give you a foolish answer to an honest question." She lifted her eyes. "Will you give me till after the 15th? There's a thing I've got to see finished first. Then I'll answer you plain." He looked at her a long moment, and he was not a stupid man, and something in his face told her he already knew what her answer would be, and had known before he came, and had come anyway because it was the decent thing to do. He stood and put on his hat. "After the 15th, he said. And he went. It was the 10th of March when Cora came. Amos's daughter drove out from the city where she'd married, in a hired car, in a good coat, and she came into her father's yard, and she saw smoke rising from the chimney and the woodpile stacked high against the north wall, and the gate hanging true on its mended latch. And she came into the kitchen and found Della Rourke at her dead mother's stove with an apron on. Cora stopped in the door. "Who are you?" she said. Though half the county could have told her. Amos rose from his chair. "Cora, who is this woman, Papa, in Mama's kitchen, in Mama's apron?" "This is Della Rourke, our neighbor. She's—" and he stopped, because there was no small word for what she was. And he could not reach the large one. Cora's face had gone white and then red. She was 30, and she was tired, and she was frightened for her father in the way that comes out sideways as anger. "I know what she is," she said. "The whole county knows what she is. I heard it before I was off the train. The Rourke widow, that's been chasing you all winter. Splitting your wood. Cooking your supper." She turned on Della. "Mama's not been in the ground a year. And you've moved into her kitchen and set your cap at a man with a farm about to sell, and you think nobody sees it. After the place. After Mama's things. After the land. Cora," Amos's voice cracked like a green board. "It's true, and you're too soft to say it. She's after Mama's place." And Della stood at the stove with the spoon in her hand and said nothing. Because there was nothing she could say that would not sound like exactly the thing the girl accused her of, and because the girl was grieving, and grief has to have somewhere to go. But it was what it did to Amos that broke it. He'd stood there through the winter and let the warmth come back into him. He'd eaten her broth and burned her wood and sat across her supper and let himself, for whole hours at a time, forget to be guilty. And now his daughter stood in Ruth's doorway with Ruth's eyes and named it out loud, and every bit of the guilt he'd set down came back onto him at once, and he could not bear it. He turned to Della. His face was gray. "You'd best go," he said. The kitchen went dead silent. "Amos," Della said. "You'd best go home, Della." He would not look at her now. He looked at the floor, at the wall, at anything. "The girl's right that folks are talking. It's not fitting. I never asked you to any of it. I'll not have Ruth's name," his voice failed. He got it back. "I'll not have Ruth's memory made cheap for a warm supper. You've been a good neighbor, and I thank you, and now you'd best go and let an old man be." Della set the spoon down. She untied the apron slow, and she folded it, and she laid it over the back of the chair. She did not cry, and she did not argue. She had her dignity, and she kept it around her like the coat she was putting on. But at the door she stopped, and Amos, because he was a decent man and this was killing him, said the thing he'd been holding all winter behind his teeth, said it low and ruinous, to her back, because he could not have said it to her face. "Were I younger," he said, you'd be my wife." She went still with her hand on the latch. "I want you to hear it once so you'll not think I sent you off for not wanting you. I've wanted you since the first morning I stood at that window and watched you swing another man's axe in the dark for my sake." His voice was breaking apart now. "But I'm an old man, Della, 64 years old with a mortgaged grave and a note called, and 5 days to lose everything I've got. I've nothing to give a woman but debt and a cold house and a few years and a burying. I'll not chain a good woman to that. You go marry Harlan Voss. He's the right man and I'm not, and being younger's the least of the reasons." Della stood at the door a long moment with her back to him. Then she opened it. And she went out, and she crossed the yard to the woodpile, and she took up Henry's axe from where it leaned, and she raised it, and she drove it down hard into the chopping block, so it stood there upright and quivering, buried an inch deep, the smooth handle straight up in the cold air. She left it standing there. Henry's axe in Amos Cade's block. And she walked home across the section line one more time, in the daylight, with nothing over her shoulder, and did not once look back. Grandmother Aldous came the next day. She was 79 years old, Ruth's own mother, and she'd heard the whole of it from Cora's own mouth, and she'd made her son-in-law drive her the 40 miles from where she wintered. And she came into that cold kitchen with a bundle under her arm, and she sat herself down in the chair by the stove, and she looked at Amos Cade until he could not look back. Cora stood by the window, her arms crossed, still hard. "You sent that woman off," the old lady said. "It was not a question." "I did," said Amos, "to keep my Ruth's name clean." Amos said nothing, which was a yes. Grandmother Aldous was quiet a while. Her hands moved on the bundle in her lap. Then she began to unfold it, and it was the quilt. The wedding ring quilt from the cedar chest. The needle still standing in the unfinished corner, and she spread it out over her old knees. "I'll tell you the last thing my daughter ever said to me," she said, "for I've been carrying it near a year and waiting to know who to give it to." She smoothed the calico rings with one thin hand. She knew she was going. She was clear-headed at the end, my Ruth, clearer than the rest of us. And she said to me, "Mama, don't you let Amos freeze in this house alone. He doesn't know how to be alone. He never learned it." She said, "This house was built to be warm. A warm house needs a woman in it, and Amos needs looking after, and I'll not rest thinking of him cold." The old woman lifted her eyes to him. She said, "When the right one comes, you tell him I said so. You tell him he's not to sit in the dark being faithful to a dead woman. I'd rather he was warm." Amos Cade put his face in his hands. "You've got it backwards, son," Grandmother Aldous said, gentle now. "You think loving that Rourke woman is stealing something from my girl. It isn't. It's the last thing my girl asked for, and you're too stubborn in your grief to give it to her." She held the quilt out across the space between them. "This was for your marriage bed. Ruth never finished it. I think she left it for another pair of hands to finish. I think she'd have liked that. You take it, Amos, and you take it to that woman, and you tell her Ruth Cade said she was welcome in this house." And Amos Cade, 64 years old, wept into his hands like a boy and took the quilt. By the window, Cora had begun to cry too, silent, her hard arms come loose at her sides. "Grandma," she said, "I said such things to her. I told her she was after the land." "I know you did," the old lady said. "You were frightened. Now you'll go and unsay them." The 15th of March came in gray and thawing. The snow was going to mud on the courthouse road, and the whole county came down it. They came in wagons and on foot and in a few old rattling cars, and they filled the yard before the Cade porch steps. And they stood shoulder to shoulder and said very little, and every man of them had his hands in his pockets, and every man of them was waiting. Vernon Pike came in his motor car in his wool overcoat, with a leather ledger under his arm and an auctioneer beside him, and he saw the crowd, and he thought nothing of it. A crowd came to every sale. A crowd was only people who liked to watch a man go under. He mounted the steps. He opened his ledger. Amos Cade stood at the top of his own porch with his hat in his hands and his daughter on one side of him and old grandmother Aldous on the other, and Della Rourke stood down in the crowd where she belonged, and Pike did not know one face from another. By order of the Cattlemen's Trust, the auctioneer began. The property of Amos Cade, being 1/4 section with dwelling and outbuildings, is offered at public sale for satisfaction of a note in the amount of $214. We'll open the bidding. Who'll say 200? Nobody said 200. The auctioneer waited. Come now. A 1/4 section and a sound house. Who'll say 100? Nobody said 100. A man near the front, a big farmer named Tolliver with mud to his knees, took his hands out of his pockets and cupped them around his mouth. I bid a nickel, he said. There was a low sound through the crowd, not quite a laugh. Pike's head came up. I bid a nickel, Tolliver said again, plain and loud. 5 cents for the farm. The auctioneer looked at Pike. Pike's mouth had gone thin. You'll bid seriously, the auctioneer said, or you'll not bid. That's my serious bid, said Tolliver. 5 cents. 6, said a woman's voice. It was a widow from the East Road. I hear 7, said another man, grinning now. Pike stepped forward to the rail. This is a lawful sale, he said, and his city voice was sharp. These are not lawful bids. I'll have the sheriff, but the sheriff was standing down in the yard with mud on his own boots, and the sheriff did not move, and the sheriff said, mild as milk. A bid's a bid. Mr. Pike, man offers money, that's a bid. Law doesn't say how much a man's got to offer. And then a stranger tried. He was a speculator, a smooth man in a good coat who'd driven out from the city on a tip that a fine farm might go cheap. And he saw what was happening, and he saw a bargain slipping, and he called out, $50. The yard went silent. Every face in that crowd turned and looked at him. 200 faces. Farmers, widows, old men, boys. They did not say a word. They only turned, all of them, slow, and looked at the man in the good coat and let him feel the whole weight of the county's eyes standing between him and that porch. He looked around at them. He saw the mud and the patched coats and the still, hard faces. He understood all at once exactly where he was standing and exactly how far it was to his car. He said, I withdraw. I withdraw the bid. And the not-quite laugh went through the crowd again. And it was a colder sound this time, and the speculator got himself back to his motor car and did not stay for the end. 10 cents, said Tolliver. 15, said the widow. They ran it up a nickel and a dime at a time, the whole county bidding against itself for a farm they all meant to hand right back, and Vernon Pike stood at the rail of a porch that was not his, with his ledger open and his face gray. And there was not one thing in the law he could do about it, because it was all of it lawful, every penny of it, and he knew it. It closed at $2.15. $2.15, the auctioneer said, and he could barely keep his own face straight saying it, going once, going twice. He looked at Pike. Pike said nothing. Sold. Tolliver climbed the steps. He dug in his pocket and counted out $2.15 in coin into the auctioneer's hand, nickel and dime and penny. And he took the paper of sale, and he turned, and he did not keep it. He walked to Amos Cade and he put the deed to Amos's own farm into Amos's 2 hands. There's your farm, Amos, he said. Bought and paid. It's yours. And the county let out its held breath all at once, and the yard came apart in a roar. Vernon Pike closed his ledger. He closed it slow, and the little snap of it was lost in the noise. He had his $214. The sale had satisfied the note. That was the cruelty of the thing. It was all legal, and the bank was paid its due, and got not 1 acre for its trouble. He went down the steps through a crowd that opened for him, and did not touch him, and did not speak to him, which was worse than if they'd shouted. He got into his motor car. He drove off down the muddy road alone, and not one soul in that yard watched him go. They had already turned their backs. Amos Cade stood at the top of his steps with the deed to his farm in his hands and his whole county below him, and he could not speak for a moment. Then he handed the deed to Cora, and he came down the steps, and he walked through the crowd to his woodpile. Henry Rourke's axe still stood in the chopping block where Della had driven it 4 days before. He took hold of the smooth handle, he worked it loose. And he set a log up on the block, and he raised the axe over his gray head, and he brought it down clean, and the log fell in 2 halves. And the ring of it went out over the whole silent yard the way it had gone out over the field every morning all that long winter. He stood the axe head down on the block. He turned, and he found her in the crowd. "Della Rourke," he said. The county went quiet to hear him. 4 days ago I stood in that kitchen and told you I was too old, that I'd nothing to give a woman but a mortgaged grave. Well, he looked around at the yard, at all of them, at the farm that was his again because she'd split his wood in the dark and asked nobody's leave. The grave's not mortgaged anymore. And I was wrong about the rest of it too. A man's not too old to be kept warm. He came a step toward her. Nor too old to keep a woman so. He held out his hand. I said I'd not chain you to an old man. I'm asking you instead to have one. Right here, in front of the whole town that talked, so there's no corner of this county doesn't know I asked you proud and glad. Will you marry me, Della? And Della Rourke, 53 years old, a widow 2 winters, who had crossed a frozen field 91 mornings certain she'd buried her last chance at love in the ground with Henry. Della put her hand in his. "I will," she said. "You stubborn old fool, I will." Cora reached her first. She came down through the crowd, and she knelt right there in the mud in front of Della and took both her hands and said, "Forgive me. Forgive me, I said such things. I'd be honored, Mama would be honored. Welcome. Della, welcome to us." And she said her name like it was a good thing, which was the only apology worth the name. Harlan Voss was there in the crowd in his Sunday coat, for he'd come like everyone came. And when it was plain how it had gone, he lifted his hat off his head, and he held it to his chest a moment, and he tipped it toward the 2 of them on the steps. A grave, gracious thing, no bitterness in it. "He's a lucky man," Voss said, to nobody, to everybody. "Amos Cade's a lucky man." And he put his hat back on and he clapped with the rest, which is what a good man does when the answer was always going to be no. And Grandmother Aldous came slow through the crowd with something folded over her arm. She climbed the steps to Della and she pressed into her hands the corner of the wedding ring quilt, the unfinished corner, the needle still standing in the cloth. "You'll finish it," the old woman said. "You and him, 4 hands. Ruth would have liked that." She said so. And she pressed Della's hands closed over it and smiled her slow, deep smile, and it was a blessing, and everyone there knew it for one. They were married in the Sable Creek church in the spring, when the fields had greened and the 2 farms, for they worked them as one now, the fence between let down, stood black and turned and ready under a soft sky. It was a small wedding. Cora's children carried flowers up the aisle, wild plum and the first of the lilac, and dropped most of them, and it was perfect. Over the mantel of the warm house hang 2 things now, side by side. Ruth Cade's wedding ring quilt, finished at last by 4 hands through a long good winter, the rings all closed. And Henry Rourke's axe, oiled and retired, the smooth handle catching the firelight. That split a widow's cold wood 91 mornings and asked for nothing. The woodpile against the north wall is full. It is no longer a secret who fills it. And sometimes of an evening, sitting by that warm hearth with her husband asleep in his chair and the fire ticking down, Della Rourke will look at the 2 things over the mantel, the quilt and the axe. And she'll say a dry word to the both of them. To Ruth and to Henry, to no one and to everyone. "Turns out I wasn't too old," she'll say. "I was just early." It is never too late for the heart, not at 53, not at 64, not ever, so long as there's a fire that wants tending and someone in the dark willing to tend it. Tell me in the comments, who's the person you'd split wood for before dawn?